How do you accidentally run for president? Tim Johnson was a 42-year-old accountant living in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. A man of routine, Tim's life revolved around numbers, his loyal Labrador, Baxter, and the occasional weekend fishing trip. He was the kind of guy who kept his head down, worked hard, and enjoyed the simple things in life. Politics was something Tim avoided. To him, it was a distant game played by people who had nothing in common with his everyday life. One Friday evening, Tim attended a town hall meeting. The event was more out of a sense of civic duty than genuine interest, and he sat at the back, half listening as the candidates for the upcoming local elections spoke. The town was small, and the political scene even smaller, with only a handful of people showing up. As the discussion turned toward the national election, the mood in the room soured. People were frustrated, fed up with politicians who seemed out of touch, making promises they never intended to keep. Tim, frustrated as well, leaned over to his friend Mike and whispered sarcastically, "Maybe I should run for president. I couldn't do any worse than these guys." His friend laughed, but as the meeting dragged on, Mike began to mull over Tim's offhand comment. After the meeting, Mike, who had had one too many beers that night, took to Twitter and posted, "If Tim runs for president, I'm voting for him," with a picture of Tim waving awkwardly at the town hall. The next morning, Tim woke up to dozens of notifications on his phone. Confused, he saw that Mike's tweet had gone viral. Thousands of people were retweeting it, saying they would support a regular guy like Tim over the career politicians currently in the race. At first, Tim laughed it off, but as the day went on, the tweet gained even more traction. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon Tim found himself being contacted by reporters wanting to know more about the everyman who had unintentionally started a movement. When a major news network called to ask if he would do a live interview, Tim was caught off guard but agreed, thinking it would all blow over soon. The interview was a blur. Tim tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that he wasn't actually running for president, but the host kept steering the conversation toward why people might want someone like him in the race. By the end of the segment, Tim had inadvertently made a case for himself without realizing it. By the next day, Tim Johnson for president was trending across social media. The media loved the idea of an outsider who represented the frustrations of ordinary Americans. People from all walks of life started reaching out, sharing their stories, and encouraging him to run for real. As the weeks passed, Tim's accidental candidacy became more than just an internet joke. People began showing up at his home, asking how they could volunteer. His neighbors put up "Johnson for President" signs in their yards, and donations started trickling in from people who believed in the idea of a true outsider candidate. Tim's quiet life was turned upside down. He was overwhelmed and tried several times to put an end to it, but every attempt seemed to make his campaign stronger. One day, a group of young political activists knocked on his door. They had organized a grassroots campaign on his behalf, and they weren't taking no for an answer. They saw in Tim what the country needed: someone who wasn't a politician, who wouldn't play by the usual rules, and who understood the struggles of the average person. Feeling a mix of guilt, responsibility, and curiosity, Tim decided to meet with them. The activists were passionate and sincere, convincing him that if he didn't at least consider running, he was letting down thousands of people who were counting on him to be their voice. The turning point came when Tim was invited to speak at a rally organized by his new supporters. The event, held in a small park downtown, was supposed to be a modest gathering. But when Tim arrived, he was shocked to see hundreds of people holding signs, cheering his name, and chanting for change. He realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what he represented to these people. Standing on the small stage, Tim looked out at the crowd, feeling a lump in his throat. He took a deep breath and spoke from the heart. He talked about how he was just an ordinary guy, frustrated with the same things they were, and how he never intended to run for president. But as he spoke, he saw the hope in their eyes, the belief that maybe, just maybe, someone like him could make a difference. By the end of his speech, Tim hadn't officially declared his candidacy, but everyone knew he was in. The momentum was too strong, and Tim realized he couldn't walk away from it now. Tim Johnson's accidental campaign began in earnest. He quit his job, assembled a small team of volunteers, and started traveling across the country, meeting people, listening to their concerns, and speaking out against the entrenched political establishment. As the primaries approached, Tim found himself on the ballot in several states, much to his surprise. His campaign focused on honesty, transparency, and putting people before politics. The media continued to portray him as the ultimate outsider, and despite his lack of experience, or maybe because of it, his support continued to grow. Tim's journey was filled with challenges and doubts, but he embraced his role as the voice of the unheard. What started as a joke in a small Ohio town had turned into a full-fledged presidential campaign, and Tim Johnson, the reluctant candidate, was now on a path that could change his life and the country forever. The general election was a battle like no other. Tim faced off against a seasoned opponent with deep ties to Washington. The campaign was grueling, with every word Tim uttered dissected and debated. His opponents tried to paint him as unqualified and inexperienced, but Tim stuck to his message of honesty, integrity, and putting people first. Election night was tense. The polls had been close, and no one could predict the outcome. As the results started to come in, it became clear that Tim's message had resonated with a significant portion of the electorate. He won key battleground states by narrow margins, but the race was too close to call. In the early hours of the morning, after a long and nail-biting count, the final results were announced. Tim Johnson had won by a small margin, just a few thousand votes in a key state.